Hello, I'm Rod Peppiatt from the Avenue Uniting Church congregation in Blackburn, Victoria, meeting on Wurundjeri country. We continue our journey through the Easter season and looking at resurrection experiences of the disciples and Jesus' followers and friends. Today, it's quite a long story and perhaps one of my favourites. It's the story of Jesus meeting with two of his friends on the road to Emmaus. It comes from Luke's Gospel. Now on that same day, the day of resurrection, two of the disciples were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking with each other about all of these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognising him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walked along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem that doesn't know the things that have taken place here?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in word and deed before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to Rome to be condemned to death and crucified. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. And yes, and beside all of this, it's the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they didn't find his body, they came back and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near to the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he was going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening and the day is almost over." So he went in. When he was at the table with them, he took bread and broke it, blessed it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognised him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. It's funny, I'm always glad when this story comes around. For me, Easter without this story is somehow not quite Easter. Meeting again with Jesus and his disciples on the road to Emmaus always makes an impact on me. Maybe it's because I love the humour with which Luke talks about the disciples not recognising Jesus. I love their incredulity when he asks them, all innocent like, "What's been happening?" "Really? Where have you been, sir? Don't you have Facebook?" Maybe it's the notion of Jesus explaining himself using the law and the prophets. I have a picture of them thinking to themselves as they listen. "Isaiah? I don't remember that in Isaiah. I must have been asleep the day we did Isaiah in synagogue." Or it may well be the way that they invited this talkative stranger in to stay with them when they reached where they were going. It's actually all of those things. But mostly It's the fact that they recognised Jesus as he broke their bread. After all the explanations and scriptures preparing the way, it's the act of Eucharist, communion, the blessing and sharing of food that becomes the moment of revelation, of meeting God in a new way. The grief-stricken, traumatised and fearful disciples in this moment encounter resurrection, and their world is turned upside down again. This one that they had followed but now didn't recognise becomes for them the risen Christ, set free from all human limits, and their story begins again. Movement and meal led to revelation. And then Jesus is gone, vanishing from their sight, but leaving them with warmed hearts and lively spirits and energised bodies. So energised, in fact, that they go all the way back to Jerusalem right then to share their good news that Jesus is risen and on the road. As happens in other resurrection stories, Jesus doesn't stay long. There seems to be an urgency about him in the stories of resurrection that was rarely there in his life. Maybe the various storytellers had a sense that God was on the move, having done this great thing. Certainly the stories of the early church suggest a sense of urgency and a struggle when obstacles got in the way of doing new things and sharing new insights with other pilgrims on the journey. For Luke, it matters that the two disciples don't simply sit around their house in Emmaus exchanging surprised looks or forming a committee. It matters that they get up and go back to let the others know what has happened. Their testimony, their story becomes a vital part of the resurrection narrative and the means by which others join the story. And they do this without the ongoing physical presence of Jesus, the one who had been there for them and with them before. Their story in many ways is our story, and that's what I love most about it. Just like the story of Jesus' encounter with Thomas that we talked about last week, this one finds me and draws me into it. And that happens despite the fact that we don't know where Emmaus is located. We know roughly, but it's not on the maps. Despite the fact that we don't really know who the disciples were. Despite the fact that we can't work out why they didn't recognise Jesus. And probably a few other historical challenges with the story. I find myself identifying with the great scholar Dominic Crossan, who suggests that all we don't know about Emmaus should perhaps open us to the possibility that Emmaus is everywhere. Crossan once said two things about the Emmaus story that resonate with me. The first thing was, whether we understand it literally or metaphorically, as I do, its message is still the same. Even with all the teaching beforehand, it was in the hospitality of the disciples and the breaking of bread by Jesus that they recognised him. And it was that to which they responded, not the doctrine. And secondly, Crossan is not convinced that this story describes a historical event, but he believes it's true. In that sense, he echoes another great scholar, Marcus Borg, who once prefaced a story by saying he identified with a Native American storyteller who said, "I don't know if this story happened like this, but I know it's true." Crossan, like Borg, would say the same thing about Emmaus. Crossan actually says it like this: Emmaus, the event, may never have happened, but Emmaus, the encounter, always happens. Just imagine, wherever we are on the road, whenever we're on the road and at meal times, we discover the life-giving presence of Jesus among us. filled with energy and possibility and the joy of resurrection. Just imagine. The way of heaven is among us always, as Jesus said it was, becoming real each time we open our eyes to it, each time we hear the scriptures, each time we share food, maybe even each time we breathe. On all our journeys, in all the times we break bread together, may this be our truth in the name and the way of the risen Christ. Amen.